Nobody in Caldwell County could figure out why anyone would pay good money for the old Pruitt place. It sat at the end of a gravel road that most people avoided, half a mile past the last mailbox that still got mail. The fences leaned like they were tired of standing. The roof had long since forgotten its one job, and rain came through it as easily as it came through open air. Even the weeds seemed to be losing interest, thinning out where the soil had gone hard and gray. The farm had passed through 3 owners in 20 years, and each one had walked away poorer than they arrived. Corn wouldn't take in that clay. Cattle wandered the far pasture looking for grass that wasn't there. By the time the bank finally auctioned it off, most folks in town figured the land itself was cursed, or at least too stubborn to be worth saving. So when a woman named Louise Hartley bought it outright, in cash, people assumed she hadn't done her homework. She was 61, recently widowed, and had spent 30 years teaching high school biology 2 counties over. Nobody had ever seen her drive a tractor. Nobody had ever seen her lift a hay bale. And when the moving truck pulled up that first week, it didn't carry tractors or seed drills or any of the things a person needed to save a dying farm. It carried 7 goats. The laughter started before the truck had even finished unloading. Dale Kessler, who ran the feed store and had an opinion about every piece of land within 20 miles, stood at the fence line shaking his head. She bought a farm for goats, he told anyone who'd listen. That's like buying a ship for ducks. The line made its way around town within a day, repeated at the diner, at church, at the gas station, where men leaned against their trucks and traded theories about the crazy school teacher and her livestock. Louise heard the jokes. She never once argued back. She just kept unloading feed, checking fences, and learning the names of 7 animals that most of her neighbors couldn't tell apart. Nobody in Caldwell County realized it yet, but those goats were never meant to be the whole business. They were only the beginning. To understand why the town laughed so hard, you have to understand how goats got their reputation in the first place. For generations, cattle had been the measure of a serious farmer. A man with 50 head of beef cattle was respected. A woman with 7 goats was, at best, keeping a hobby. Part of this came from history. Goats were one of the first animals humans ever domesticated, going back roughly 10,000 years, long before cattle became the centerpiece of American agriculture. But in the United States, goats had been pushed to the margins, associated with subsistence farming, with poverty, with small plots of land that couldn't support anything bigger. Cattle meant scale. Cattle meant a real operation. Goats, in the popular imagination, meant you couldn't afford anything else. What almost nobody in Caldwell County knew was how wrong that assumption had always been. Goats are remarkably efficient converters of forage into food, and they'll eat plants that cattle and horses walk right past. A single goat can browse more than 500 different plant species, including thistle, poison ivy, honeysuckle, and the kind of woody brush that chokes out a pasture until nothing else can grow. Where cattle need open grass, goats thrive on the exact vegetation that ruins land for everyone else. Their manure breaks down quickly and adds nitrogen back into depleted soil, something the Pruitt place desperately needed after decades of poor management. Their milk, less commonly known, has smaller fat globules than cow's milk, which makes it easier to digest for a surprising number of people who struggle with dairy. There are meat breeds, dairy breeds, and fiber breeds that produce cashmere and mohair, each one suited to a different kind of income. Watching a herd of goats clear a hillside is, frankly, a little bit like watching a demolition crew that accepts payment in leaves. They move in a loose, curious cluster, stripping back years of overgrowth in weeks instead of seasons. It is unglamorous work, and it doesn't look like progress from a distance. Up close, it is one of the oldest tricks in agriculture, rediscovered by people who had run out of other options. None of this made it into the conversation at the feed store. The town knew goats as a punchline. Neither did most people outside of farming ever stop to learn otherwise. To understand Louise, you had to go back further than the farm. She had grown up on her grandfather's land in the next county, one of the last generations to remember when small mixed farms were still common, before consolidation swallowed most of them into larger operations. Her grandfather had kept a handful of goats alongside his cattle, mostly to clear the fence lines and keep the blackberry brambles from taking over the lower pasture. She remembered following him out at dawn, watching the animals work through a patch of land that looked hopeless and leaving it looking tended. She had spent her working life teaching biology, watching generations of students memorize facts about ecosystems without ever touching soil. When her husband passed after a long illness, she found herself with a modest inheritance, a restless kind of grief, and a memory of her grandfather's goats that had never quite let go of her. Buying the Pruitt place wasn't impulsive. She had spent 2 years reading everything she could find on regenerative grazing, on goat husbandry, on small farm economics, before she ever wrote a check. None of that context reached the town. What reached the town was an image of a widowed schoolteacher wandering around with 7 goats, and it was funnier without the details. The mockery took its own shape over that first year. Children in town started bleating at each other on the playground, a joke that made its way back to Louise more than once. The diner ran a standing gag about her, something a waitress finally admitted to her with an embarrassed laugh. Trucks slowed down on the gravel road, just so their drivers could get a good look and something to talk about later. Louise kept working. She didn't correct anyone, didn't defend herself at church, didn't post angry things online the way some people might have. She simply showed up every morning, moved her fence lines, and got to know which goat liked to test the wire, and which one preferred to nap in the shade of the one working oak tree left on the property. By the second spring, something on the Pruitt place had started to change, though it took a sharp eye to notice at first. The thick tangle of brush along the back fence line, the kind that had swallowed 3 previous owners' attempts at pasture, had thinned dramatically. Where blackberry brambles had once formed an impassable wall, there was now open ground, scarred but recovering. Louise had learned to move her goats in careful rotations, penning them into one section of land at a time so they'd clear it thoroughly before moving on, giving the previous section time to rest and regrow. It is a method as old as pastoral farming itself, though it had fallen out of fashion once chemical brush clearing became cheap and easy. Rotational grazing works slower than a bulldozer or a herbicide tank, but it works with the land instead of against it, and the results compound over time in ways that spraying never does. Wildflowers came back first, seeds that had been sitting dormant in the soil for years finally getting enough light to sprout. Where wildflowers went, bees followed, and where bees followed, so did the kind of quiet biodiversity that a poisoned field never sees. Birds that hadn't nested on the property in a decade started showing up again, drawn by insects that hadn't had a home in years. The goats themselves were thriving. 2 does gave birth to healthy kids that spring, an outcome that felt small on paper but meant everything to Louise, proof that her animals were adapting well to land everyone else had given up on. She began experimenting with the milk, first just for her own kitchen, then in small batches of soft cheese. She gave away to a few curious neighbors willing to try it. People noticed the land looking different when they drove past. They still weren't impressed. A cleared fence line and a few wildflowers didn't look like success to a county that measured farms and acres of corn and head of cattle. But something had shifted, even if nobody was ready to say it out loud yet. It was the third year when the numbers started to matter, and it began with a conversation Louise had almost by accident at a farmer's market table where she'd started selling her cheese. A retired accountant named Wallace Greer, who had moved to the county to be near his daughter, struck up a conversation about her operation and asked, half out of curiosity, whether she'd ever actually run the math on what she was doing. She hadn't, not formally. So they sat down together that winter and did. The cost of raising a single goat, once you accounted for feed, minerals, and basic veterinary care, turned out to be lower than most people assumed, especially once the animals were browsing enough of their own forage that supplemental feed dropped sharply. Breeding fees were modest, and with 2 does producing kids each spring, Louise's herd had grown from 7 animals to nearly 30, without her spending much beyond what the land already provided. Then there was the milk. A single dairy goat can produce close to a gallon a day during peak lactation, and once Louise began selling raw milk and soft cheese at the market, that income started to add up in a way that surprised even Wallace. Soap made from goat milk, something she'd started almost as a hobby, turned out to have a devoted little following of its own. On top of that, word had started to spread among a few larger landowners in the county who had brush problems of their own, and 2 of them had begun paying her by the acre to bring her herd through and clear land the old-fashioned way. "I thought goats only ate everything," Wallace told her, only half joking, once he saw the full picture laid out on paper. "They do," Louise said, "including my mortgage. It wasn't a fortune. Not yet. But it was multiple streams of income, built off animals that most of the county still considered a joke." And once Wallace mentioned the numbers to a cousin who worked at the local bank, the whispering in town started to change shape. What made Louise's farm interesting to people who actually studied agriculture went deeper than the income. Goats practice something called selective grazing, meaning they naturally target the plants that are easiest to digest first, which forces a kind of built-in crop rotation across a pasture without a person ever having to manage it directly. Managed correctly, that grazing pattern breaks the life cycle of internal parasites that would otherwise build up in a herd, since rotating goats off a section of land before parasite larvae mature interrupts the infection cycle almost entirely. The deeper story was in the soil and the land itself. Grazing animals moved correctly, stimulate root growth, and help pull carbon down into the ground, rather than releasing it into the air, a process researchers at several land-grant universities had begun studying seriously as interest in regenerative agriculture grew. Where cleared brush might otherwise be burned or left to become fuel for wildfire, goats convert it into manure and muscle, reducing fire risk in a way that costs almost nothing beyond the animal's own appetite. Native grasses, suppressed for years under invasive brush, began reasserting themselves across the Pruitt place as the goats worked through section after section. It was slow, unglamorous science, playing out on land that had been written off as ruined. The goats weren't destroying anything. They were healing a piece of ground that 3 previous owners had only managed to exhaust further. None of this showed up in a single dramatic before and after photo. It showed up gradually in soil samples, in the return of birds and pollinators, in fence lines that no longer needed a chainsaw to walk. By the 4th and 5th years, the Pruitt place had stopped being a punchline and started becoming a destination, though the shift happened slowly enough that most people in town couldn't say exactly when it occurred. A teacher from Louise's old school brought a class out for a field trip, and the visit went well enough that other schools started calling to schedule their own. Local chefs, hunting for something to set their menus apart, came looking for her cheese directly instead of buying it secondhand at the market. A cheesemaker 2 counties over reached out about a supply partnership. Veterinary students from the state university asked to observe her rotational system for a research project on parasite management. Neighboring farmers, the same ones who had once laughed at her from truck windows, started showing up quietly, usually alone, to ask a few questions about fencing or breeding stock. Nobody wanted to be seen asking the widow with the goats for advice. Not at first, but curiosity eventually won out over pride. There were funny moments woven through all of it. A group of second graders spent an entire field trip naming every goat in the herd, most of them after cartoon characters, and Louise never had the heart to change the names back. One buck escaped his pen during a tour and made it halfway to the parking lot before Dale, of all people, chased him down and hauled him back by the collar, muttering under his breath the whole way. Another goat developed a habit of stealing sandwiches directly out of visitors' hands if they got too close to the fence, an incident that happened often enough that Louise eventually put up a sign warning people to keep their lunches at a safe distance. Underneath the laughter and the field trips, the income kept growing. Louise still hadn't told anyone the full numbers. She wasn't hiding them out of secrecy so much as simple habit, the same quiet reserve that had carried her through years of being the punchline in a town that hadn't bothered to ask what she actually knew. The visitors kept coming. The goats kept working. The fields kept changing. And the people who had laughed the loudest had quietly stopped laughing. If stories like this remind you that the world's biggest opportunities are often hiding inside the smallest ideas, take a moment to subscribe. Every week we uncover real agricultural stories that prove hard work, patience, and a little wisdom can change everything. Now, let's see what happened when the accountant finally opened the books for good. The reveal came at a small community meeting that fall, one that Wallace Greer had half-organized without telling Louise exactly what he had planned. He'd asked her to bring her records, just in case anyone had questions about her operation, and she'd agreed without much thought about who might show up. More people came than either of them expected. Wallace stood at the front of the room and walked through the figures line by line, the way he might have once presented a client's portfolio, except this time the client was a herd of goats and a piece of land the whole county had written off a decade earlier. Annual revenue across her cheese, milk, soap, breeding sales, and brush clearing contracts had grown into a figure that made several people in the front row sit up straight. Operating costs, once feed savings from browsing were factored in, were a fraction of what a comparable cattle operation would have required on the same acreage. Her herd had grown from 7 animals to over 60, with breeding contracts now bringing in steady income on their own. Land that had been appraised as nearly worthless when she bought it had appreciated significantly, driven largely by the visible health of the soil and pasture. Workshop fees from the veterinary, students, and agricultural groups added a modest but reliable stream. A state conservation program, impressed by her brush clearing and native grass recovery, had even begun offering her a small annual incentive payment for the ecological work her herd had done, essentially for free. When Wallace read the final profit figure aloud, the room went quiet in a way that a room full of farmers rarely does. An old man near the back, one of the loudest voices from those first years of jokes, finally broke the silence. "I thought she was crazy," he said, mostly to himself. The man next to him, a farmer who'd run cattle on the same land his whole life, shook his head slowly. "No," he said. She was just early. The years that followed brought a quiet kind of vindication, though Louise never treated it as a victory lap. Neighbors who had once slowed their trucks to laugh started stopping to ask, seriously this time, how she'd built what she built. 2 families in the county started their own small goat herds, modeling their fencing and rotation almost directly off hers. Young people, some of them former students from her teaching days, began reaching out with questions about regenerative grazing and small farm economics, treating her the way people treat someone who figured something out before everyone else caught on. Children who had once bleated at each other on the playground grew up hearing a different version of the story, one where the joke had quietly become the lesson. The farm at the end of the gravel road, the one nobody wanted, the one 3 owners had walked away from, was impossible to ignore now. People still called it the Pruitt place out of habit, though most understood it belonged to Louise Hartley in every way that mattered. Sometimes success doesn't arrive with roaring engines or giant machinery. Sometimes it walks quietly on 4 small hooves, chewing weeds everyone else thought were worthless. The loudest voices may laugh first, but in the end, the numbers have a way of speaking louder than opinions ever did.